Hi, today we are going to learn how to sift our way through poetry. So, have you ever read a poem and after you finished reading it, you sat there and you looked like this guy here on the left, totally confused, bewildered, no idea what the heck this poem is even supposed to mean? Well, using a method like the SIFT method is going to help you so that you don't end up looking confused and bewildered. When you first encounter a poem, the first thing you should do is read the poem. You should actually read it a couple of times. The first time, read it just to hear its rhythm, how the words sound, how it creates rhythm, either using rhyme or repetition. Just read it to see how it sounds. Then read it and pay a little bit more attention to the words. Pay attention to the words that are used. Are they positive words? Are they more negative words? Are there any words that you don't know? Any words that stand out? This is what you should do when you first get a poem. Read it two times. First, for to gather its rhythm. The second time, to pay a little closer attention to its words. Now, after the second reading, you might still look like this guy here. So, what are you going to do next? Next, you're going to use your toolbox. Your toolbox is full of different types of techniques that you can use to figure out what in the world this poem means. So, the tools in your toolbox are the same tools that a poet uses to create their poem. So, each letter in SIFT stands for a different tool in our toolbox. The S stands for symbols, the I for imagery, the F for figurative language, and the T, we kind of tricked you there. It stands for two different things, tone and theme. So these are the tools in your toolbox, but they're also the tools that a poet uses to create their poem and give it meaning. All right. So let's take a look at each letter of SIFT. S for symbols. Objects are people that represent something else. I for imagery. Descriptive language that makes you use one of your five senses to create an image in your mind. F for figurative language. These are things like similes, metaphors, hyperboles, etc. And T for tone and theme. Tone, the attitude of the author, and theme, the overall message of the poem. All right, so let's dive into symbols. Symbols are objects that stand for something else. They usually stand for feelings, emotions, thoughts, or ideas. So let's take a look at three very common symbols. We have the symbol of the red rose. A red rose is literally a red flower, a red rose. But symbols also have something called figurative meaning, and that's the emotional meaning behind the object. So, the emotional or figurative meaning behind the symbol of a rose is that it usually stands for love or romance. So, when you see an object of a rose in a poem, that poem usually has some sort of something to do with the topic of love or romance. Then we have the symbol of a white dove. Literally, it is a white dove, but figuratively, the emotional meaning behind it is that it stands for peace. We have fire. Literally, it is fire. Figuratively or emotionally, it could stand for destruction because fire can destroy things, but it can also stand for illumination or rebirth because out of fire comes new life or brightness, it lights up the dark. So you have to realize that sometimes symbols can have a positive or a negative figurative meaning. This is very similar to the connotation of words, how some words have a positive emotional meaning or a positive connotation, but they also might have a negative connotation or a negative emotional meaning. So that's the same for symbols. So overall, when you are assessing using this tool to assess a poem, you need to look for objects. You need to look for actual objects, and then you need to think, does this object stand for something else? And what might that something else be? Next, you're going to look for imagery. Imagery are words that make you imagine using one or more of your five senses. Now, in imagery, you want to move beyond what you are imagining seeing, but also you want to see what your other four senses are doing as well. What are you imagining hearing, tasting, smelling, touching? All of these are imagery. So let's take a look at some examples. So, like I said, Imagery makes you use one of your five senses. So here's some examples. Imagine using your sense of sight. This phrase helps you do that. An endless expanse of blue ocean reached across the land. Instead of saying the ocean was big, this author put in more adjectives, was more descriptive and more varied in their sentence, so that it actually made you imagine seeing this huge expanse of ocean. We have the fire crackled in the fireplace. This is making you imagine hearing a fire crackle. The thick, rich chocolate ran down her throat as she closed her eyes to better taste its sweetness. This is actually making you imagine the taste of chocolate. The boat rocked and hit the hard sand with a thud. This is making you feel that, imagine feeling hardness or rocking back and forth, right? Your body hitting the sides of the boat. And it's making you imagine using that sense of touch. And finally, the smell of freshly baked bread hit like a stone wall as she walked in the bakery. This is making you imagine that smell of freshly baked bread. So these are examples of imagery. Imagery, again, is making you move past just what you imagine seeing, but also what you imagine hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling. All right, now the F in SIFT is figurative language. Figurative language is basically any words or phrases that are used to give meaning by going beyond the literal meaning. So if you think back to our symbols, I told you that symbols have a literal and a figurative meaning. So literal is exactly what they are. What are you seeing? What are the words that you're reading? What is the object that you're seeing? But figurative means that you're going beyond that to what is the emotional meaning behind it? What does it represent? So symbols are a type of figurative device, but it's not a language because it's just an object. Figurative language uses words or phrases to give that further meaning. There are lots of different types of figurative language, like similes, metaphors, hyperboles, irony, personification. The list can go on. We're going to focus on three of them here, and that's similes, metaphors, and personification. Similes and metaphors are when you use words or phrases to describe something by comparing it to something else. Now, for similes and metaphors, you are comparing two things that are normally not compared. For example, you might compare heart to ice. This is not two things that are normally compared to each other, but we use them to make a point. So similes compare two objects using the words like or as. Here we have, for example, our evil queen, and I wrote, her heart was as cold as ice. There I am comparing her heart to cold ice, and I'm using the word as, which makes it a simile. This is also giving the impression that this queen is not very nice. Her heart is not warm, it's cold. She's not nice. But instead of just saying the queen is not nice, I've used a simile, figurative language, to help get that idea across. A metaphor also compares two different things, but it compares them by saying one is the other. It does not use like or as. It just says that one is the other. So, for example, I have, she is a walking encyclopedia. I'm comparing she to an encyclopedia. This is, of course, giving us the impression that she's incredibly smart. But instead of saying she's smart, I use a metaphor and that figurative language to go beyond and give my reader a little bit more understanding of just how smart she is. Next, we come to personification. Personification is a type of figurative language where you give human qualities or characteristics to objects or things that are not human. So, for example, I have the angry sea swallowed the boat. Now I'm giving the sea the ability to swallow something, when really that's a human characteristic. The sea doesn't have a throat, it can't swallow anything. But by giving it this, I am using this figurative language to impart to my reader that the sea made the boat sink. All right. And now we finally come to our last tool, our tone and our theme. The tone is the feeling the author has on the topic of a poem. The theme is the overall message of the poem. After using the S, the I, the F in your SIFT toolbox, A tone and a theme should be starting to come out at this point. So let's talk about tone. Tone can be either positive or negative. Again, this is the feeling that the author has. This is the feeling the poet has about the subject. This is not how you feel about the subject. All right. So a tone can be described as positive using words like romantic, sympathetic, confident, respectful, happy, reflective, nostalgic, which means you like to think of the past in a happy way, optimistic, passionate, proud. These are all positive tones. Then you can have negative tone. Tone can be described as doubtful, confused, fearful, hopeful, grim, gloomy, frustrated, threatening, condescending, or disrespectful. There's lots of different other words as well. But the reason and the way that we know the tone is through the choice of words that the author uses. The author is either going to use words that are very light and happy and positive, and therefore you're going to get a pretty positive tone, or they're going to use words that are pretty dark and heavy and negative, and you're going to get a negative tone. So it is important to pay attention to the types of words that the author is using. This is usually pretty clear. Finally, the piece de resistance, the theme. This is what we're trying to figure out. When we're assessing a poem, the ultimate goal is that we're able to figure out why the author wrote this poem. What message did the author want us to have? What is the life lesson? What is the advice that the author wanted us to know? I want you to be careful to realize that a theme is not a topic. A topic is one word about that describes what the poem is about. A theme tells us the author's point of view. So, for example, the topic might be friendship, but the theme might be something like friendships are important to one's happiness. You see the difference there. The topic, one word. The theme is a message or a lesson that the author wants us to know. Again, the topic might be love, but the theme might be true love is hard to find. Topic might be family, but the theme would be family are there for you in times of need. Nature might be the topic, but the theme might be nature must be respected in order to give what one needs to survive. So just keep in mind that the theme is not a one word answer. It is a message, it is a lesson that the author wants you to know. At this point, you are ready to use these tools to go ahead and sift your way through a poem and determine the meaning.